Good evening. Welcome to the NB Press Legends of the Werewolf Hunter interview series. Tonight we have Matthew Baugh. How are you doing tonight, Matthew?
Very well, thank you.
Great. Thank you for joining us. We are close to the release date of the book. October 31st is when we're going to have everything out. So we're coming up on that. We're in the magic month as we speak. And we've done interviews with almost all of the authors. There's a couple left that we still need to catch up with, and we're working on that, schedules being what they are. So tonight we're going to talk to you about your history with working with Brian and the other material that you've written as well. Let's kick things off with, how did you meet Brian in the first place?
Well, there was a period of time when I was professionally editing for a small publisher who Brian was submitting books to, and his I'm not sure. I edited his first 4 titles: the original Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter and the first of the Winter Fox books for them, and we had a lot of good back and forth, because it turned out we had a lot of interests in common, and he was a really easy guy to work with. He welcomed some small level of collaboration at the editorial stage, and he was willing to share with me a little bit of his thought as to what went into the stories, and I really enjoyed working with him a great deal.
Yeah, he's an amazingly fun person to work with. I can back you up on that. Absolutely. So when you started to work with him, how much editing had you done before that, and what's the background?
I was fairly new at it. I'd probably been doing it for about a year when I got his first book to work with. And I'd had no formal training as an editor. It was kind of there were 2 for this company at that time, myself and a woman named Baugh Medevere, who they finally decided to get her an assistant, because the workload was pretty intense, and she was very good at it, but they were trying to get her to do something like 16 books a month by herself.
I did not realize.
And they brought me in, so it went to about 8 a month for each of us, which is still insane, but it was a little more manageable. Right. And so in consultation with her, and really heavy consultation with the Chicago Manual of Style, I picked up some tricks. And it was interesting, because they weren't really reading manuscripts before giving them to the editors, and so we got some manuscripts we got some that were really, really good, and the other 80, 90, whatever percent were less.
They were interesting. So, and we're talking about Bermuda Press. And
we are.
A lot of the readers of these books, Brian's books, and of the MB books, are very familiar with the Bermuda catalog from that time period. Because we're talking about a decade or so ago, somewhere around there, give or take.
Yeah.
And Bermuda was a real shining star in the field of zombies, werewolves, vampires, monster fiction,
apocalypses. I think it might have been one of the other authors I know that's in this volume is Tom Brannan, and I'm not sure, but I think the first werewolf book Bermuda did was something that he wrote with
Snell,
D.L. Snell. And yeah, so they started branching just a bit, and I did one title for them too.
Right.
at one point, Jacob, who was the person who founded it, came to a couple of us and said, these mashups, like Pride and Prejudice and zombies, and Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters. My favorite title of that whole subgenre was Android Karenina.
Yeah.
But he came to three of us, myself, and Kim Paffenroth and Peter Kleins, and said, I would like the three of you to each pick a classic and do kind of a mashup. And Kim did Valley of the Damned, which was his version of Dante's Inferno with zombies, and Peter did The Adventures of the Lycanthrope Robinson Crusoe, which was Robinson Crusoe, not just with a lycanthrope, but also with sea monsters and Cthulhu, and a lot of interesting connections there. And I did The Vampire Count of Monte Cristo.
Yep. And that's, I think that everybody was a little sad to see them change their focus. The company changed hands, and then they took things in a different direction. So they're not doing titles like that anymore. I think for a while there, they went down the apocalyptic road pretty hard, and then they still have a few titles here and there.
It's tricky, and that's something that Jacob said. The three of us were kind of test balloons, because he didn't know. He knew that subgenre was super popular at the time, but there was no telling how popular it was going to stay. And it turns out we got in at the very tail end of it.
Yeah, the tail end of some things, the beginning of other things. I mean, that was really when print on demand was kind of finding its footing.
Yeah.
And that was when social media had just begun to be a factor, I think, in a lot of the marketing in a serious way. So that was it was a very interesting time period for a lot of things. And, that has since evolved into where we're at now, which is different again. And I'm not quite sure how, but Bermuda's last big release was the biography about Prince, if I remember.
The which?
It's about Prince, and he's not a zombie. It's actually about Prince, the musician.
Oh, yeah. I haven't kept up, I'm afraid. Well, they had, and I forget what the imprint was, but I actually edited a couple of books for their imprint where they were doing more stuff like biographies of or ghost-written books for reality stars. And Bobby worked on something really interesting. And that was there was an old TV series from the late 70s called The Man from Atlantis. And Patrick Duffy, the actor who played the main character, had come out with manuscripts for 3 sequels to that he wanted to get published. And so they were doing them under this imprint as well. A very engaging history of haunted prisons that or the hauntings at one particular prison. Okay. And another was an expose on how the moon is not really a moon. It's a hollow spaceship which our alien overlords live in.
Oh,
so
with that one, I did not know. It would explain a lot.
Well, very few people do, because it's covered up so efficiently.
Right. So
it's really good when you can get the laws of physics to help you with your cover up.
Always helpful. Then one day they send you a manuscript for Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter.
Yes.
Then the rest is history, and you've done all 4 of his books. And then naturally he wanted you to be involved with this book. And again, this book is an anthology of different authors doing their interpretation of new characters, new settings, or old stories set in his universe. So tell us a little bit about the story that you've written for this book.
Well, what kind of captured my imagination looking at it. And I'd originally thought about. He asked me if there were any of the characters that I would like to pick up and work with. And my first thought was there's an antagonist that shows up in, I think, two of the books of the original trilogy. This guy named Jericho,
Yeah.
who is just this. I mean, he's apparently a normal human being, aside from the fact that he's about 7 feet tall and is able to kick people's butts as well as if he were a supernatural creature, because he's just such a tough guy. And I thought he would be really interesting. But Brian had done some hinting that there might be something more to him than meets the eye, and I think he's kind of holding that. He's either maybe thinking of doing something with the character himself in the future, or maybe just leaving it a mystery. I know Tolkien, when Tolkien was asked about Tom Bombadil, he said, sometimes stories have to have mysteries in them that even the author doesn't know the answer to.
Mm. That's interesting. Yeah, he's never described, the full story behind Jericho at all. Mm-hmm. Jericho shows up, Jericho does what Jericho does, and then Jericho goes. And so who did you choose?
Well, I finally I chose a character who's only mentioned, and that is stands in the tombs, and he's the father of Michael Winterfox, and he's dead and gone for many years before the action of that book, of the first Winterfox book, really even begins. Mm-hmm. He's a character who's remembered, and I thought it would be really interesting to look at a little of his history. And Brian had outlined just a bit of it, just a bit of who he was and what he'd been involved in. And, he'd been involved in the Spanish-American War, and he'd been on the northern migration of the Cheyenne from Oklahoma back up to Montana and Wyoming. And he'd said a couple of kind of interesting things about him, enough to really tickle my imagination. And I asked Brian if it would be okay if I did a story with him. And he liked the idea, so we ran with that.
Yeah, and it was a really good idea. And in fact, your story is the only one that brings any of the characters from the Winterfox journals into the book. So it was really, really a great thing to see that come in. And not to mention giving a little context to the history that occurred before, before we even see the Winterfox journals. Yeah. So it's a great story.
Thank you.
I've read it, of course, and it's fantastic. I love that one. So that's really, really good. Tell us a little bit more about what you've written outside of that story, and tell us about your stuff.
I've done a lot of short stories. Mm-hmm. Some of them, we were talking a little before the interview. Two of them were published in your Monster Hunter series, and those were both with the same character. And I've done, I think, 6 or 8 stories with him. And this is somebody I first thought about writing this character when I was really young, and my family and I were going from Albuquerque to visit relatives in Phoenix. And we stopped at one of those, there are, when you get close to the border, there are all these Old West themed little touristy areas. There's a Chief Yellow Horse and Fort Courage and all these places and you can go there and you can get all kinds of kitschy souvenirs. Mm. And one of the things they had there that I thought was really interesting was a little book about, really more a booklet about Western gunfighters. And they had a character in there. They mentioned a historical guy named Dave Mather, went by Mysterious Dave Mather. And he really intrigued me for a couple of reasons. One, because he was kind of mysterious. I mean, the details of his death aren't really known. He comes and goes in a lot of places, but there's not a whole lot of background on him. And he apparently claimed to be a direct descendant of Cotton Mather of the Salem witch trials. Turns out it was the same family, but he was not a direct descendant because Cotton didn't have any children. But I thought, if I ever want to write a story that has a gunfighter dealing with supernatural stuff, this would be the perfect character to build that around. And so I did that, and I've written, and those stories, there's a little bit of traditional horror in those. Those are mostly kind of Lovecraftian horror. Mm-hmm. I've done a lot. There's a French series called Tales of the Shadow Men. Mm-hmm. There's it's Black Coat Press, and the owner of Black Coat Press is a guy named Jean-Marc Lavassière, who had done a lot of work with comics in the 80s and 90s, and he set this up, and he and I were both in on this whole Wold Newton universe thing fairly early on, where it's kind of based on Philip Jose Farmer wrote a biography of Tarzan and wrote a biography of Doc Savage, and then he brought in all these other literary characters who he claimed they were related to. And some of us just thought that was the coolest idea ever. The idea just that characters, even if they weren't related to each other, would cross each other's paths.
Yeah, it was huge inspiration for this one. So
yeah, exactly. And so we started doing a lot of stories for that. And what Jean-Marc really wanted to do is, he said he saw a lot of resurgence in American pulp authors, and he wanted to do the same thing with French pulp stories. Because some of them, like The Phantom of the Opera and Arsène Lupin, are very well known, but most of them are not well known even in France. And so he wanted to kind of revive them, because these had been the characters of he grew up with. And so they're up to, I think, volume 14, and I've managed to get a story in, I think, every volume.
Oh wow! Okay.
And they get really odd. Like the story I that was in the last volume that's been published so far, I did was there's a French book that a fair number of people in America know, The Little Prince. Mm-hmm. And the character is a little prince who lives on an asteroid, and he comes down to Earth to, I think he wants to buy a sheep so that he can take it up, because there are baobab tree sprouting on his asteroid, and he's afraid if he doesn't get a sheep to eat up all the baobab sprouts, it'll destroy his asteroid. But I figured that it would be really fun to do something really odd. And so I took Professor Moriarty, who had written, in the Sherlock Holmes stories, had written a treatise on the dynamics of an asteroid, and crossed him over with the Little Prince.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
That's definitely very creative of you.
Thank you. Yeah. Then the other publisher I've probably worked with the most is Moonstone. And it's created by Joe Gentile, and Joe has been really active in going out and getting licenses to previously existing characters. Like, he could never get Doc Savage, but he got The Avenger, which was written under the same house name, Kenneth Robeson, in the 40s. And he got rights to Zorro for a while, and the Green Hornet and the Phantom. And so I've had a lot of fun playing in those fictional universes.
Yeah, exactly. Is that the same publisher that does the Lone Ranger, or is that somebody else?
They do the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger is kind of an odd one, because the rights are kind of scattered to the wind. I found out doing these that
it gets wild.
Disney kept sending him letters saying cease and desist, because we have the rights to the Lone Ranger, and he'd write them back saying, you have the rights to the Lone Ranger in movies. The rights to the Lone Ranger in prose are separate and distinct, and they've never moved forward with that. They've just written them a couple of letters. But
he gives up.
He's been doing the Lone Ranger in prose. Disney has the rights right now to the Lone Ranger in movies, And Dynamite Comics has the right to the Lone Ranger in comic books.
Okay.
So you're getting three different products on the same property, and it's it's interesting because there's not really a good through line to those. They're all fairly distinct,
Yeah.
and that's actually the next thing I'm working on him for. Is he wants a novelette of the Lone Ranger.
Okay. All right. Good. And then Disney will pick that up and make the movie, right? And then you'll be set up. Dream.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll be dying to put my famous name up there. It would be wonderful if it happened. I suspect if they get it, it will be a very different story by the time it's filmed, but that's okay because I'll have a nice paycheck from that.
What would you say your favorite fictional universe to write in to date would be?
That's a good question. I have really enjoyed writing The Avenger. Those were books that I grew up with. I think I would really enjoy writing Doc Savage for the same reason. But I've found that when I go out and do something completely original, there's a whole new feeling to it.
Mm-hmm.
That writing, I mean, as much as I love the characters and the worlds other authors have built up, it's different and it's much more satisfying, I find.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest thing I've done that's completely on my own is I've got an unpublished young adult novel, and it's set in World War II, and it involves some refugees who are teenage kids. I really wanted to get into, because, well, it's tempting to use Nazis as bad guys because they make really, really good bad guys. But I wanted to have more depth than that. I wanted to kind of, show it's not just that these guys in these black uniforms are bad, but why are they bad? What is the mindset that goes into supporting something that bad, and what is the mindset that can effectively stand against that sort of thing? And so the kids are going to kind of represent that as they grow past their prejudices and learn to love and respect each other despite some really big cultural differences. And the kids are from groups that really suffered at that time, but they are also, because the supernatural exists very much in this world, and there are also supernatural creatures. The most central character is a young man who's one of the Romani, or as a lot of the other characters call him, a gypsy, and he is a werewolf. He runs across a couple of others. There's a young woman who is ostensibly Chinese, who was in Europe getting an education, who just got out of China before the rape of Nanking, and who is Hu Xiang, which is the fox fairy.
Okay.
And then the last is a Jewish boy who is actually he's actually a golem, and there's a whole story about how the wise man of the community in Prague, the Jewish ghetto in Prague, went up into the upstairs storage of the old new synagogue in Prague and took the clay that had been used to sculpt the golem of Prague, and he made his own golem, but he made it in the form of a child, because one of the parts of the story of the golem is you lose control of it and it runs amok. And this guy was thinking, well, if you create someone and they're already an adult, but they've never had the experience of growing up, it kind of makes sense that they would be hard to control. But if I make someone who's a child and I raise him as my son, he'll be much more empathetic with humans. The main villain in the first volume is a Gestapo guy who's also a werewolf. not also a vampire. Excuse me.
Okay.
So I should. It'd be redundant, but I could put a big symbol on his chest saying, "This guy is a villain.
Right.
This Nazi vampire is actually not good." But that might not be necessary.
I think, yeah. Well, it sounds like you got quite a few twists and turns in
A few, yeah.
there. And so you said that you haven't published it. Is it finished? Is it in a form that you're ready to
It's
publish?
unpublished.
Okay.
It is in full manuscript form. I got an agent, and she shopped it around to a number of publishers.
Yep.
And what we came back with was that they liked it, but not as, because they said, the kids were young enough that they said they would have to market it as a middle grades book, and they said it's too complicated for a middle grades book. If you age the kids up a few years and age up the themes a few years, we can probably do it as a book for teens. So I'm in the process of that, and that is hard.
Yeah, it is hard. It's hard to go back and find your original inspiration and then, change it and put it in a different outfit. And it happens all the time. And people are just like, that's not what I wanted right now, right this minute. It would be perfect lineup that I have. Instead of looking at it and saying, a lot of adults like to read, young adult fiction, and it doesn't have to be, everyone can relate to a child because they were a child at one point. It doesn't have to be your age for people to relate to it. It just has to be a compelling character.
Well, I think that was the genius, I think, of the Harry Potter books,
Oh, sure.
is that they were so enjoyable for adults as well as their target audience.
Right. That and the amazing writing. And I mean, because everybody, that story is an old story, and that's been done a bunch of times, but why did she put a new twist on it? And she's got a way with words, which I think everybody figured that one out pretty soon after the first one came out. So as far as future plans go, you're working on the Lone Ranger piece right now, and then you got anything else cooking, any other new releases? You want to do any surprise announcements?
I don't have anything planned out very far. At the moment, I'm too busy to do much. There are a lot of things I would like to do someday. I would love to do. I've thought of one that would be kind of a fun, adventurous road trip. It would be kind of a futuristic setting, kind of a weird, dismal, futuristic setting. But the characters would be a lot of fun, and the characters would be the gods of a number of ancient cultures who were trying to recover what they once were. And I would want to use the Monkey King and Artemis and Odin, and I was going to use the Archangel Gabriel and a couple of others, Coyote certainly. But just do kind of a fun road trip with them.
Monkey King, okay. That's got a fun road trip right all over.
So, but right now, I think anybody who tries anything like that, people are going to say, "Hey, you're ripping off American gods."
Well, to a degree. I mean, I think anything you do right now, you're ripping off somebody. That's what, the general viewpoint's going to be, oh, this is like that. And I don't think that they're giving any credit to the art of storytelling, the art of evolving tales, the art of reinterpreting things. I mean, terrible things to say about everything. So I don't think you can worry about that.
Yeah, and it's the. I mean, I love the writing side of the business, but the business side of the business, I'm probably like just about every other writer out there in that regard.
Not anyone that ever gets involved in any business at all. Name a profession that somebody loves, and they'll tell you, "I love doing what I do, and I hate taking care of the business aspect of it." So that was. I remember this interview with Neil Gaiman years ago. As he was releasing the Graveyard book, and he said that at some point he had just lost complete faith in that book altogether.
Hmm.
He was going to shelve the whole project. He just thought it was terrible, and then collected himself and went through and published it, and then was happy that he did. And a lot of other people enjoyed that book too. It's a nice book, and everything doesn't have to be super original that no one ever thought of before, because the chances of even doing that are pretty much
Yeah.
certain these days. And plus, I mean, I think a lot of people forget storytelling is about hitting on touchstones. I mean, if you write about something that's completely original that nobody's ever heard of, they don't
Hmm.
really think about that. You're not evoking emotions that they're used to. You're not appealing to them in ways that are appealing. They're just, oh, I guess we're trapped into this story for the next however long to see where it goes. And that's not what storytelling is about. So
Yeah.
new stuff is always good, but
Hmm.
bringing up those old emotions, old memories, bringing back
Hmm.
comparisons and things, that works too. It's all part of the deal.
Another thing I was thinking of doing, in fact, I'd even mentioned this to Tom Brannan as a possible future collaboration, was a modern sequel to Dracula, because I like Dracula, the novel, but I tend to have a lot of reservations about every sequel I've ever read. Um, it seems to go diverge so far from the source material, and it's kind of like, well, that's fine, but what if we stuck with the source material really closely and just said, what if 21st century? I think that would be a lot of fun.
Okay, so now what you've done, you've opened up the MB's Pandora box of. I've asked several of the other authors about just that, as far as the fiasco that Universal Monster property exists in right now.
Oh yeah.
Just the terrible situation that they're in. Um, and I've asked several other people, how would you fix that? What would you do with that? And you've started down that road.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you have any other
Oh
thoughts?
goodness. Well, I think one of the big things I think the Marvel Cinematic Universe did well is, they've got one person, and he doesn't micromanage, but everything clears through him.
Right.
And so that everything fits together in his mind, and that I think that makes it possible for everything to fit together on the macro scale too. I think with the universal thing, I think there were too many visions going in, and there wasn't a central vision that everything had to be focused through. And I think that really showed itself, especially when you got in a couple of actors who wanted to have a great deal of creative control, and 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 there wasn't a good way to kind of pull back when they did things that were excessive.
Okay. Did you see the version of the Mummy with Tom Cruise?
I was not going to mention Tom Cruise by name when I was talking about actors who maybe needed to be reined in, but
Okay.
I'm afraid that's who I was thinking of.
That's what it was reminding me of. And I think that, right then and there, you get into an idea like, if you involve Tom Cruise in a project, it immediately becomes a Tom Cruise project. What were you thinking?
Yeah, yeah, and it's kind of like, I think there was a lot of talent and a lot of, going back to the Lone Ranger. I think there was a lot of talent
Well,
and a lot of uh, potential going into the Lone Ranger movie. Uh, Good director, good writers, at least early on, attached to the script, a good cast, but it it felt like a whole muddle of ideas that didn't fit together, that were just kind of jammed up and put in a pretty package. And I really don't like that movie.
yeah, well, it's the opposite of what you described with the Marvel universe, where
Yeah,
there's one guy that's in charge and overseeing all of it, so he ensures that everything is going to fit together, as
yeah,
opposed to the Lone Ranger movie, which is a collection of ideas and subplots kind of thrown together by a bunch of different committees and, glued together and little, scotch tape and there and some rubber bands. And then they call it a movie. And you're like, okay, if you want to do that, I suppose we could. So, yeah, that one didn't make a lot of sense. And it's amazing how many movies, I think Marvel's up to like 21 or something. I don't know for sure. But, they've kept that narrative very together throughout all of it.
Yeah.
They do a great job, even when they go back in time, forward in time. I mean, they're very careful so that it always makes sense.
Yeah, and there are people on the internet who will say, "Well, I found these little plot holes and so on," and there's some merit to that. But I mean, you have to look really, really, really hard. The thing feels good the way it all fits together.
Yeah, I think too that you have to give some credit to, did you go back and really watch that movie 8 times?
Yeah.
Detail, because when you go to the theater and you're watching and you don't catch, that little flub,
yeah,
who cares, man? I mean, come on. Like, if you enjoy it, was it worth, the price of admission? Then we're gonna let that slide because, that's. I was explaining this the other day to one of the authors of our book that's coming up. And I said, no matter how many pairs of eyes are on this thing, there's going to be some glaring editorial misspelling, grammatical nightmare. It happens every book. You're like,
yep.
How could we possibly have missed that? And there it is. And the book's already done. You're like, okay. Just gotta roll forward. And then what you find out later on after multiple books, and people just enjoy the stories. They didn't hit that, misspelled word or what have you and just close the book and put it down and say, I can't continue with this. Not going to throw a huge roadblock in the story, then they're okay with it. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, I agree.
So Dracula in the modern age, that would be interesting.
One of the things I've noticed going back and rereading Dracula is I've noticed that the sequels will usually do something like, well, this is part of Dracula's plan to conquer the world with vampires.
Right.
And when you go back to the original novel, he didn't have a plan. He was an aristocrat who was moving to a new country, and that was basically it.
Right.
And the fact that he was an evil vampire lord added a lot more drama there than if he'd just been a normal human aristocrat.
Bela Lugosi, I think, probably had more influence on the future of Dracula than Dracula did, because Dracula isn't anything like the movies, any of his portrayals later on. He wasn't. He's never been portrayed, I think, very closely to the original book.
There was a really interesting video I came across that was rating every Dracula movie by comparing it point by point to the novel, and it came out with, and I basically agreed with their top choices. Their second choice was the Bram Stoker's Dracula that came out a few years ago with Anthony Hopkins and was it Gary Oldman. Because it had a lot of the same scenes in there. I think it was only thematically that it was different in a number of places. But the one that they chose was also, I think, my favorite. As number one was also my favorite, and that was years ago. The PBS aired a British production of Dracula, and it was Louis Jourdan as Dracula, and oh goodness, who else was? I think Frank Finlay was Van Helsing, and I didn't even know who the other actors were. And it was low budget. There was hardly anything in the way of effects, but they really captured the novel pretty well, I thought.
Yeah, you could do that whole book without a lot of effects.
Mm-hmm.
You really could. And I've got very mixed feelings about Bram Stoker's Dracula and what Coppola did with that. We don't have enough time to get into that.
Yeah, they really lost me when they tried to make it into a love story.
Yeah, they took a lot of liberties with that one, and of course, the nature of the book versus making
Yeah.
a modern film out of it. Yeah, you're gonna have to do some stuff, but it's still
Yeah.
not my favorite. And the original Dracula film, which had again very little to do with it. I mean, it's a neat classic movie, but it
Yeah.
doesn't really have a lot to do with the book. And as you pointed out, no one ever really digs into that character. What
Mhm.
is he doing? What's
Yeah.
up with that?
The other thing I'd like to do differently. What's that?
So there's a lot to explore there.
Yeah, there is. There is. The other thing I'd like to do differently than a lot of people do is a lot of people in their sequels, they just assume about a lot of the weaknesses of the vampire and a lot of the powers of the vampire. And it's like, okay, sunlight will destroy Dracula. Well, not in the novel. In the novel, he's
So many
weaker,
inconsistencies. Yeah, so many. It's crazy.
and in the novel, he isn't killed by a stake through the heart.
Nope.
A couple of guys knife him. That's,
Yeah.
um, and so it's just really it would be fun to play with that a bit.
Yeah, but I mean, at this point where we're at in culture, um, you'd have more people that are familiar with everything that they've heard since. And all of a sudden
Absolutely.
they're like, "Oh, well, that would kill him." You're like, "Well, you take that part up. The actual novel didn't have anything to do with that."
Yeah.
So stay through the heart.
Yeah.
That's not going to do it. And then you
Well, wait a
start.
second. Sunlight shouldn't kill him. It should make him sparkle.
Well, that's different. That's a little bit different. That has to come up in every interview. Definitely
Sorry.
a hard day for Monster Hunter fans, and that's
Yeah.
I'm a dedicated Monster Hunter fan, and I also will have to admit my wife loves the Twilight movies. So on any given day, you walk by the TV, you're like, oh, he's sparkling. How about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think at that point you've got to say you're into a whole new genre. It's not vampire horror. It's not traditional vampire horror at all any longer. It's its own thing,
It's its own thing. Yeah.
and so it probably doesn't do anybody any good to compare them too closely.
Romance, fantasy stuff, and
Yeah.
I think that the idea that the author brought in some monsters. I mean, I guess we can call that cool. She brought that in to spice it up, and it's her own thing and it's her own world, and we should all be so lucky as to be that successful.
That's very true.
Yeah, yep. But it still hurts. Not gonna lie. Can't watch the Vampire Sparkle. That doesn't.
I feel it.
Yep. Exactly. All right. So, are there any other projects that you have that you wanna push, that you wanna talk about right now? Is there anything on Amazon that someone can go punch a button and get right now?
Well, most recent thing I've got on Amazon is Lone Ranger and Tonto Frontier Justice from Moonstone. I wrote one of the stories and edited the rest, and that was a really fun book. And we one of the things that I really liked about that and the preceding volume is we brought in a couple of Western writers who'd won the Spur Award, and they turned in some really good stories. And I think a take on the character I really enjoyed a lot.
Yeah. If I ever get around to doing my Doc Holliday as a werewolf hunter, always got that kind of floating back there, and just never have done it, but it's there.
I actually I did a vampire story once with Doc Holliday in it.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't sure how to deal with the vampire, and Doc Holliday took out his dental tongs and pulled its fangs.
Yeah, there you go. The whole dental angle. Yeah. Exactly. Good. Okay. Tell us where we can find you on social media.
You can find me on Facebook. I have a Twitter feed also. They're both under my name, Matthew Baugh.
Okay.
And I guess this gives me a reason to go back and actually post a few things on Twitter now.
Okay. Always good to update the social media these days. All right. Well, then, I thank you for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you.
You too.
Looking forward to the book coming out and everyone getting to read your story. And that's October 31st. So thank you very much.
All right. Have a good day.
You too. Thanks.